My name is Vivian, and I'm 67 years old. I never thought I'd be sitting here telling you this story, my hands trembling not from age but from the weight of what I've carried. It was last spring on a Tuesday morning when my daughter-in-law, Claire, looked me in the eye and said, "You're just the babysitter now, Vivian. This isn't your house anymore." Her voice was sharp like a blade slicing through years of love I'd poured into my son, David, and the home I'd built with my late husband, Henry. I stood there in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd kneaded dough for Sunday dinners, where I'd bandaged David's scraped knees, where I'd cried when Henry passed 10 years ago. And in that moment, I felt like a ghost, invisible in my own life. I didn't respond to Claire. I couldn't. My throat tightened, and all I could do was pick up my granddaughter Lily from her high chair and carry her upstairs. Lily's tiny hands tugged at my sweater, her giggles a fleeting warmth against the coldness of Claire's words. But as I changed her diaper, my mind churned. How had it come to this? How had I, the woman who'd raised David, who'd sacrificed everything, become just the babysitter? I looked at myself in the nursery mirror, gray hair, pulled back lines etched deep around my eyes, and I barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked tired, defeated. But somewhere beneath that exhaustion, a spark flickered, too faint to name, but too stubborn to ignore. Let me take you back a bit so you understand who I am and how I ended up here. I was born in a small town in Ohio, the daughter of a school teacher and a factory worker. We didn't have much, but we had love, the kind that fills you up, even when the pantry's bare. I married Henry when I was 22, and we built a life together modest but ours. He was a carpenter with hands that could craft a table as easily as they could wipe away my tears. We had David 2 years later, and I poured my heart into being his mother. I stayed home, sewed his Halloween costumes, cheered at his baseball games, and saved every penny to give him a chance at college. When Henry got sick, I became the caregiver, the breadwinner, the everything. I worked as a receptionist at a dentist's office, balancing doctor's appointments and David's school plays. And when Henry died, I held our family together, even as my own heart broke. David was 25 then, just starting his career in finance. I was so proud of him, his ambition, his drive. I sold our old house, the one Henry and I had paid off, and used the money to buy a bigger one in the suburbs, a place where David could start his family. I thought we'd all live there together like the families you see in old movies, generations under one roof. I paid the mortgage every cent because I wanted David to have a foundation, a legacy. When he married Claire, I welcomed her like a daughter. I cooked her favorite meals, helped plan their wedding, even gave them my mother's pearl earrings as a gift. And when Lily was born, I retired early to care for her to be the grandmother I'd always dreamed of being. I thought I was building something beautiful. I thought I was needed. But somewhere along the way, things shifted. It started small, Claire's sighs when I offered advice, David's distracted nods when I spoke. They'd talk over me at dinner, make plans without asking me, leave me out of decisions about the house. I told myself it was normal that young couples need space. But then came the comments. "Vivian, you don't need to come to Lily's school events. We've got it covered. Vivian, maybe don't rearrange the kitchen. Claire likes it her way." I'd smile, swallow my hurt, and keep going because that's what mothers do. I kept babysitting Lily, cooking meals, cleaning the house, all while Claire worked long hours at her marketing job, and David traveled for his. I thought I was helping. I thought I was still part of the family. That Tuesday morning, though, everything shattered. Claire had come home early, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor I'd polished the day before. Lily was napping, and I was folding laundry in the living room. David was there too, scrolling on his phone, barely looking up. Claire tossed her purse on the counter and said, "We need to talk, Vivian." Her tone was clipped like she was addressing an employee. She went on about how they were planning to renovate the house, how they wanted to modernize it, make it their own. I nodded, thinking I'd be part of the conversation. But then she said it, "You're just the babysitter now. This isn't your house anymore. We think it's best if you move out maybe to a senior apartment nearby. You'd be more comfortable there. I felt the air leave my lungs. Move out. This was my home. I'd chosen every paint color, planted the roses in the garden, paid every bill. I looked at David, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he just stared at his phone, his jaw tight like he was hoping the moment would pass. "David," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "is this what you want?" He glanced up, his eyes flickering with something, guilt maybe, but he nodded. "It's for the best, Mom. We need our space." I don't remember what I said next. I think I mumbled something about needing to check on Lily. I walked upstairs, my legs heavy, and sat on the edge of the guest bed, my bed, in the room they'd relegated me to after Claire redecorated the master suite. I stared at the wall at a framed photo of David and me from his high school graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling. Where had that boy gone? How had I become a burden to the son I'd given everything for? The rest of the day passed in a blur. I cared for Lily, made dinner, smiled when Claire came home. But inside, I was unraveling. That night, alone in my room, I cried for the first time in years. Not soft tears, but the kind that shake your whole body, the kind you stifle so no one hears. I cried for Henry, who'd always made me feel seen. I cried for David, who'd once called me his hero. I cried for myself, for the woman I'd let myself become, someone who'd given so much, she'd forgotten her own worth. But as the tears slowed, that spark I'd felt earlier grew. It wasn't loud or bold, not yet. It was quiet, like the first light of dawn. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I couldn't stay invisible. I'd spent my life building this family, this home, and I wasn't going to let it slip away without a fight. Not a fight with shouting or anger, but something deeper. Something only I could do. I fell asleep with that thought. My heart heavy, but my resolve beginning to take root. The next morning I woke early before the rest of the house stirred. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and looked out at the garden. The roses were blooming their petals bright against the dawn. Henry had loved those roses. He'd planted them for me, a gift for our 10th anniversary. "They're like you, Viv," he'd said. "Strong, beautiful, and a little stubborn." I smiled at the memory, and for the first time in months, I felt a piece of myself return. I wasn't just the babysitter. I was Vivian, the woman who'd survived loss, raised a son, built a home. And I was going to remind them of that, starting with myself. That morning, with the roses glowing outside and the house still quiet, I sipped my coffee and let the weight of Claire's words settle into me. "You're just the babysitter now." They stung, yes, but they also woke something up. It was as if I'd been sleepwalking through my own life, letting David and Claire's dismissals chip away at me until I was smaller than I'd ever been. But sitting there, I felt the edges of myself sharpen. I wasn't ready to fight, not in the way you might imagine, with raised voices or slammed doors, but I was ready to remember who I was, and that I realized was the first step. The days that followed were strange, like living in a house that was mine but didn't feel like it. Claire and David carried on as if nothing had happened. Claire would breeze in after work, dropping her keys on the counter and asking about Lily's day without so much as a glance at me. David was worse in his own way. His silence was louder than any insult. He'd come home, kiss Lily's forehead, and mumble something about being tired before disappearing into his office. I kept up my routine, feeding Lily, reading her stories, folding laundry, cooking dinners they barely thanked me for. But inside, I was different. I was watching, listening, piecing together the life I'd been pushed out of. I started noticing things I'd ignored before. The way Claire would talk about our house when she showed friends around, pointing out the new chandelier she'd bought or the paint colors she'd chosen. The way David would nod along, never once mentioning that I'd paid for every brick of this place. I'd hear them late at night, their voices drifting through the walls, planning renovations, vacations, a future that didn't include me. "We'll need to figure out what to do with her," Claire said, once her tone casual, like I was an old piece of furniture they were debating whether to keep. David's response was a low murmur. I couldn't make out, but it wasn't a defense. That hurt more than anything, the absence of his voice standing up for me. Loneliness crept in like a fog. I'd always been strong, the one who held things together, but now I felt untethered. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering where I'd gone wrong. Had I given too much, loved too fiercely? Or was this just what happened when you grew old? People started seeing you as less until you were nothing but a shadow in their story. I missed Henry so much it ached. He'd always had a way of making me feel solid, like my presence mattered. "You're the heart of this family, Viv," he'd say, his hand warm on mine. Without him, I wasn't sure where my heart belonged. But then, about a week after Claire's words, something shifted. I was at the grocery store pushing my cart down the aisle when I heard my name. Vivian Harper. I turned to see a woman with silver hair and a warm smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. It took me a moment, but then it clicked. Margaret, my old friend from the dentist's office where I'd worked. We'd been close back then, sharing lunches and stories about our kids, but we'd lost touch after Henry died. "My goodness, it's been years," she said, pulling me into a hug that felt like coming home. We stood there in the cereal aisle catching up. Margaret was a widow now, too, living alone, but vibrant, her laugh as bright as I remembered. She asked about David, about Lily, and I gave her the polished version, the one where everything was fine. But Margaret had always seen through me. "What's wrong, Viv?" She asked, her voice soft but firm. I hesitated, my throat tight, but then it spilled out. Not all of it, but enough. Claire's words. David's silence, the way I felt like a stranger in my own home. I expected pity, but Margaret's eyes flashed with something else. "You're not a babysitter, Vivian," she said. "You're a mother, a grandmother, a woman who built that life. Don't let them make you forget that." Her words stayed with me like a seed planted in dry soil. When I got home, I looked at the house differently. The roses in the garden, the creaky porch step. Henry had never gotten around to fixing the dining table, where we'd celebrated every birthday they were mine, not just in memory, but in truth. I'd paid the mortgage, signed the deed, carried the weight of this place. Claire could redecorate all she wanted, but she couldn't erase that. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I reminded them of it, not with anger, but with the quiet certainty Margaret had stirred in me. I started small. The next day, when Claire asked me to watch Lily while she went to a work event, I said, "I can't today, Claire. I have plans." It wasn't true, not yet, but the look on her face, a mix of surprise and annoyance, felt like a tiny victory. I spent the afternoon at the library, flipping through gardening books, letting myself dream about the roses again. The day after that, I called Margaret and invited her for coffee. We met at a little cafe, and for 2 hours I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. She told me about her book club, her volunteer work at the community center, the trip she'd taken to Italy last year. "You've got to keep living, Viv," she said. "Not for them, but for you." I began to reclaim pieces of myself bit by bit. I dug out an old photo album from the attic filled with pictures of Henry and me, David, as a boy, our life before it all changed. I'd look at them at night, not with sadness, but with pride. I'd been strong then, and I could be strong now. I started gardening again, spending mornings with my hands in the dirt, coaxing the roses back to life. Lily would toddle out to join me, her tiny fingers patting the soil, and those moments felt sacred, like I was passing something down to her, even if her parents didn't see it. But the hurt was still there, sharp and raw. One evening, I overheard Claire on the phone talking to a friend. "Vivian's fine, but she's slowing down," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "We're thinking of getting a real nanny soon, someone younger." I stood in the hallway, my heart pounding, and realized they weren't just pushing me out of the house, they were pushing me out of Lily's life, too. That was the moment I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I couldn't let them rewrite my story. I started paying attention to the details. I'd ignored the bills, the paperwork, the legalities. I found the deed to the house in an old filing cabinet, my name clear as day. I remembered the lawyer we'd used when Henry and I bought the place, a kind man named Mr. Thompson. On a whim, I called his office just to ask a few questions. "Vivian," he said, his voice warm through the phone, "you own that house outright. They can't make you leave." His words were like a lifeline pulling me out of the fog. I didn't tell him everything, not yet, but I made an appointment to see him the following week. I didn't say a word to David or Claire. I kept smiling, kept caring for Lily, kept cooking their dinners. But inside, I was building something, a plan, a strength, a way to take back what was mine. I wasn't sure how it would unfold, but I knew one thing: I wasn't the babysitter. I was Vivian Harper, and this was my house, my life, my story. And I was going to write the next chapter myself. The appointment with Mr. Thompson was set for a Thursday morning, and I woke that day with a quiet determination I hadn't felt in years. I told Claire I'd be out for a few hours, that she'd need to watch Lily herself. Her eyebrows shot up, a flash of irritation crossing her face, but I didn't wait for a response. I grabbed my purse, slipped on my old wool coat, and walked out the door before she could say anything. The air was crisp, the kind of spring morning that smells like new beginnings, and as I drove to Mr. Thompson's office, I felt a strange lightness, like I was stepping into a version of myself I'd forgotten. Mr. Thompson's office was small, cluttered with files and framed photos of his grandchildren. He greeted me with a handshake and a smile that put me at ease. "Vivian, it's been too long," he said, gesturing to a chair. I sat down, my hands folded in my lap, and told him everything, not just the deed, but the way Claire and David had made me feel, the way they'd pushed me to the edges of my own life. My voice shook at first, but as I spoke, it steadied. Mr. Thompson listened, his eyes kind but sharp, nodding as he jotted down notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Vivian, you're in a stronger position than you realize. The house is yours. They have no legal claim to it. If you want them out, you can make that happen." His words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through me. I could make them leave. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. I'd spent so long trying to keep the family together, to be the glue that held us, that the idea of tearing it apart felt foreign. But as I sat there, I realized it wasn't about tearing anything apart. It was about reclaiming what was mine. Not just the house, but my dignity, my place in the world. I asked Mr. Thompson what my options were, and he walked me through them: eviction, selling the property, transferring the deed to a trust. He didn't push, just laid it out plainly, and I left his office with a folder of papers and a spark of possibility. Driving home, I felt different, stronger but also heavier. I loved David despite everything. He was my son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep, the man I'd cheered for at every milestone. And Lily, sweet curious. Lily was my heart. The thought of disrupting their lives, of being the one to draw a line, made my chest ache. But then I thought of Claire's voice, so casual and cruel. "You're just the babysitter now." I thought of David's silence, his refusal to meet my eyes, and I knew I couldn't keep living like this, shrinking to fit their version of me. When I got home, Claire was in the kitchen, bouncing Lily on her hip, her phone pressed to her ear. She barely looked at me, just muttered something about a meeting she was late for, and handed Lily over like I was hired help. I took Lily, her warm weight grounding me, and watched Claire rush out the door. I didn't feel anger, not exactly just clarity. I was done being invisible. I kissed Lily's forehead and whispered, "We're going to be okay, little one," though I wasn't sure who I was reassuring. That afternoon, I called Margaret. She'd become my lifeline, the one person who saw me as more than a grandmother or a widow. We met at her house this time, a cozy place filled with books and sunlight. Over tea, I told her about the lawyer, the deed, the options Mr. Thompson had laid out. Margaret's eyes lit up, not with malice, but with pride. "You're taking your life back, Viv," she said. You don't have to be loud about it. Just steady. She told me about a friend of hers who'd faced something similar, a daughter who'd treated her like a burden. The friend had sold her house, moved to a cottage by the sea, and started painting again. She found herself, Margaret said. You can too. Her words stayed with me, and I started to act on them in small ways. I stopped doing Claire and David's laundry, letting their clothes pile up until Claire snapped at David to take care of it. I spent more time with Lily outside, teaching her the names of flowers, telling her stories about her grandfather. I even started writing in a journal, something I hadn't done since I was young. At first, it was just fragments, memories of Henry, moments with David when he was small, but then it became something else. I wrote about the hurt, the betrayal, the way I'd let myself fade. And I wrote about the woman I wanted to be again, strong, whole, unafraid. One evening, I was in the garden pruning the roses when David came outside. It was rare for him to seek me out, and my heart lifted for a moment, hoping for a real conversation. But he just stood there, hands in his pockets, and said, "Claire's upset, you're not helping as much. She says it's stressing her out." I kept pruning the snip of the shears steady. "I'm doing what I can, David," I said, my voice calm but firm. "This is your family too. You figure it out." He blinked, surprised, and for a second, I saw a flicker of the boy he'd been unsure, needing guidance. But then he turned and walked back inside, and I knew that boy was gone. The next day, I went back to Mr. Thompson. I told him I wanted to explore my options further to understand what it would mean to take control of the house. He suggested setting up a trust one that would protect my assets and give me leverage. You could stipulate who stays in the house under what conditions, he said, or you could sell it and start fresh. I wasn't ready to decide, but I asked him to start the paperwork for the trust. It felt like planting a seed, something that could grow into a future I chose. I also started looking into my finances. Henry and I had always been careful, and after his death, I'd saved what I could from my job and the sale of our old house. I found a financial advisor, a woman Margaret recommended, who helped me see the bigger picture. I had more than I'd realized, not a fortune, but enough to live comfortably to start over if I wanted. The realization was freeing, like shedding a heavy coat. I didn't need David and Claire's approval to live my life. I didn't need their permission to be whole. But the loneliness didn't vanish. There were nights when I'd sit in my room, the house quiet, and feel the weight of it all. I'd think of Henry, how he'd hold my hand during tough times, his thumb brushing my knuckles. I'd think of David as a boy running to me with a scraped knee, trusting me to make it better. Those memories were a comfort, but they also hurt because they reminded me of what I'd lost. I started wearing Henry's old watch, a simple thing with a leather strap to feel closer to him. It ticked softly on my wrist, a reminder that time was still moving, that I could move with it. One morning, I was at the park with Lily, pushing her on a swing, when a woman about my age struck up a conversation. She was a grandmother too, and we talked about our grandkids, the joys and the challenges. She mentioned a local gardening club, a group of women who met to share tips and plants. "You should come," she said. "We're a friendly bunch." I hesitated, but something in her smile made me say yes. That weekend, I went to my first meeting, nervous but curious. The women were warm, their laughter easy, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. I brought a cutting from my roses, and they admired it, asking me to share my secrets. I realized I had something to offer, something valuable. Those small steps, Margaret's encouragement, the gardening club, the trust, the financial clarity, were stitching me back together. I wasn't the babysitter, and I wasn't a burden. I was Vivian, and I was finding my way. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew I was ready to face it, not with anger, but with the quiet strength that had always been inside me, waiting to be remembered. The gardening club became my sanctuary, a place where I could be Vivian, not the babysitter, not the mother-in-law, not the widow, but just me. Every Saturday, I'd drive to the community center, a cutting from my roses or a potted herb in hand, and spend hours with women who saw me. We'd talk about soil, pH, and pruning techniques, but also about life, our losses, our joys, the way the world sometimes tried to make us feel small. One woman, Ruth, had a laugh that filled the room, and she'd tease me about my magic touch with roses. "You've got a gift, Vivian," she'd say, and I'd blush, but I was starting to believe her. Those mornings reminded me that I wasn't just surviving, I could still grow, still bloom. Back at the house, though the air was heavier, Claire and David had noticed my changes, though they didn't say it outright. Claire's sighs were sharper when I said I couldn't watch Lily, and David's silence had a new edge, like he was annoyed, but didn't know how to say it. One evening, Claire cornered me in the kitchen, her arms crossed. "Vivian, we're struggling here," she said, her voice tight. "You're gone all the time, and I had to cancel a client dinner because I couldn't find a sitter." I looked at her, at the woman who'd called me a babysitter in this very room, and something shifted inside me. "Claire," I said, my voice steady, "I'm not your employee. I'm Lily's grandmother, and I have a life too." Her mouth opened, then closed, and she walked away, muttering something I didn't catch. It wasn't a victory, not really, but it was a line drawn, and I felt stronger for it. I kept meeting with Mr. Thompson, refining the trust. He'd drawn up papers that would protect the house and give me control over who lived in it. "You can set terms," he explained. "If you want David and Claire to stay, you can, but on your conditions. Or you can ask them to leave." I wasn't ready to decide, but I asked him to prepare another document, an eviction notice, just in case. The word eviction felt harsh, like something from a courtroom drama, but holding that possibility gave me a strange calm. It was power, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that waits steady and sure. I also started digging deeper into my past, not just my finances, but my dreams. One night, I found an old sketchbook in the attic filled with drawings I'd done when David was young. I'd wanted to be an artist once before life got in the way. The sketches were simple flowers, landscapes, Henry's hands, but they were mine, a piece of the woman I'd been. I bought a set of pencils and started drawing again just for myself. I'd sit in the garden with Lily, sketching her as she played, capturing the way her curls caught the light. Those moments felt like a bridge between who I was and who I could be. Margaret noticed the change in me. We'd started having dinner together once a week, taking turns cooking. One night, over her famous lasagna, she said, "You're different, Viv. There's a fire in you again." I laughed, but she was right. I told her about the trust, the sketches, the gardening club. She listened, her eyes bright, and then she said something that stuck with me. "You're not just taking back your house. You're taking back your story." Her words were like a mirror showing me a woman who was more than the sum of her hurts. But the house was still a battlefield, quiet but tense. One afternoon, I came home from the gardening club to find Claire and a contractor in the living room discussing a renovation. "We're thinking of knocking out this wall," Claire said, gesturing like she owned the place. The contractor nodded, scribbling notes, and neither of them acknowledged me. I stood there, my hands still smelling of earth, and felt a surge of something, not anger, but resolve. "Claire," I said, my voice clear, "any changes to this house need my approval. I own it." The contractor looked up surprised, and Claire's face flushed. "We're just planning Vivian," she said, her tone dismissive. I didn't argue, just nodded and walked away. But I called Mr. Thompson that evening and told him to finalize the trust. I was done waiting. I started making other changes too. I moved my things out of the guest room and into the master bedroom, the one Claire and David had claimed. It was symbolic, but it felt right. I didn't tell them, just did it while they were at work setting up my books, my sketches, Henry's watch on the nightstand. When Claire came home and saw it, she stormed into the kitchen where I was making tea. "What are you doing, Vivian?" "That's our room." I looked at her, calm but firm. "It's my house, Claire. I'm taking it back." She stared speechless, and for the first time I saw uncertainty in her eyes. David came home later, and I heard them arguing in hushed tones, but he didn't confront me. I think he knew deep down that I wasn't bluffing. I also started spending more time with Lily, not as a babysitter, but as a grandmother. I'd take her to the park, tell her stories about her grandfather, teach her to plant seeds in the garden. One day she picked a rose and handed it to me, her little face beaming. "For you, Nana," she said, and I nearly cried. I realized that whatever happened with David and Claire Lily was my legacy, and I'd fight to stay in her life, not by begging, but by being the woman she'd remember with pride. I kept writing in my journal, and it became a kind of map guiding me through the fog. I wrote about Henry, how he'd believed in me. I wrote about David, the boy he'd been and the man he'd become. I wrote about myself, the mistakes I'd made, the strength I was finding. One night, I wrote a letter to David, not to give him, but to say what I needed to say. I gave you everything I wrote, but I forgot to give myself something too. I'm not your servant, and I'm not a ghost. I'm your mother, and I deserve better. I burned the letter in the garden the next morning, the smoke curling into the sky, and it felt like letting go of something heavy. I also reached out to the financial advisor again, asking her to help me explore selling the house, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to know I could. She ran numbers, showed me what I'd gain, where I could go: a small house by the lake, a condo in the city, even a trip like Margaret's to Italy. The possibilities were dizzying, not because I craved adventure, but because they meant I had choices. I wasn't trapped, not anymore. The gardening club invited me to lead a workshop on roses, and I said yes, nervous but excited. Preparing for it, I spent hours in my garden, tending to the plants, sketching them, writing notes. The day of the workshop, I stood in front of 20 women, my hands steady as I talked about soil and sunlight, about patience and care. They listened, asked questions, and when it was over, Ruth hugged me and said, "You were born for this, Vivian." I smiled, but inside, I was glowing. I was building something new, not just for others, but for myself. But back at home, the tension was palpable. Claire and David were colder, their conversations clipped, but I didn't shrink. I kept gardening, sketching, writing, planning. I wore Henry's watch every day, its tick a reminder of time, mine, not theirs. I wasn't sure when or how I'd make my next move, but I knew it was coming. The trust was nearly ready, the eviction notice waiting in my drawer, my heart growing stronger with every step. I was Vivian Harper, and I was rewriting my story, one quiet, deliberate choice at a time. The weeks that followed felt like I was walking a tightrope, balancing between the life I'd always known and the one I was building. The house was still a minefield of unspoken tensions, but I moved through it differently now, with a quiet confidence that came from knowing my worth. Claire's sharp comments and David's silence no longer cut as deeply. They were like rain on a window, sliding off without soaking through. I was focused on myself, my roses, my sketches, my growing circle at the gardening club. But I was also preparing, gathering strength, for the moment I knew was coming, when I'd have to decide what to do with the house and the family I'd once thought was mine. One morning, I was in the garden with Lily, showing her how to water the roses without drowning them. She giggled, her tiny hands clutching the watering can, and for a moment, everything felt right. But then Claire appeared at the back door, her phone in hand, her expression pinched. "Vivian, can you watch Lily this afternoon? I have a last-minute meeting." Her tone was less a question than a demand, and I felt that old pull to say yes to smooth things over. Instead, I looked at her and said, "I'm busy today, Claire. You'll need to make other arrangements." Lily kept watering, oblivious, but Claire's face hardened. "This is getting ridiculous," she muttered, turning back inside. I didn't respond, just helped Lily set the can down, my heart steady. I wasn't bending anymore. That afternoon, I met with Mr. Thompson again. The trust was finalized, giving me full control over the house and its future. He'd also prepared the eviction notice, a single page that felt heavier than it should. "You don't have to use it," he said, his voice gentle. "But it's there if you need it." I nodded, tucking it into my purse. I still wasn't sure what I'd do. Evicting David and Claire meant upending Lily's life, and that thought twisted my heart. but knowing I had the power to choose, that I wasn't at their mercy, gave me a clarity I hadn't had in years. I started spending more time outside the house, carving out space for myself. The gardening club had become a second home, and I was planning another workshop this time on propagating plants. Ruth and the others were encouraging their faith in me, a balm for the wounds David and Claire had left. I also joined a local art class, something I'd found through the community center. It was intimidating at first, sitting among strangers with my sketchbook, but the teacher, a soft-spoken woman named Carla, saw something in my drawings. "You have a real eye, Vivian," she said, pointing to a sketch of my roses. "There's emotion here." I hadn't thought of my sketches as art, just a way to remember, but her words lit something in me. I started drawing more, not just flowers, but moments. Lily's smile, Henry's watch, the way the light hit the garden at dawn. Margaret was my cheerleader through it all. We'd walk in the park sometimes, just the two of us, and she'd ask about the trust, the house, my plans. "You're not just surviving, Viv," she said one day, her arm linked with mine. "You're thriving." I wasn't sure I'd go that far, but I felt the truth in her words. I was finding joy again, not in big moments, but in small ones. The weight of a pencil in my hand, the smell of earth, the sound of Lily calling me Nana. Those were mine, and no one could take them away. But the house was a constant reminder of what I still had to face. One evening, I overheard Claire and David in the living room, their voices low but heated. "She's acting like she owns the place," Claire said, her tone venomous. "We need to get her out, David. This is our home." David's response was quieter, but I caught it. "She's my mom, Claire. It's complicated. Complicated." The words stung, reducing everything I'd done for him to a problem to be solved. I stood in the hallway, my hand on the wall, and realized that David wasn't going to fight for me. He might feel guilty, but guilt wasn't love, and it wasn't enough. That night, I sat in the master bedroom, my bedroom now, and opened my journal. I wrote about the house, how it had been my dream, a place for family, for love. I wrote about Henry, how we'd chosen it together, imagining our grandchildren running through the halls. And I wrote about David, how I'd given him everything only to be pushed aside. The words poured out raw and unfiltered until I reached a question. What did I want? Not for David, not for Lily, but for me. I stared at the page, the pen trembling in my hand, and for the first time I let myself imagine a life without this house, without the weight of their expectations. A small house by the lake, a garden of my own, a room for my sketches. The thought was terrifying, but it was also freeing. The next day I called the financial advisor and asked her to start looking for properties. Nothing big, just a place that could be mine. She sent me listings and I spent hours poring over them, imagining a fresh start. I also asked Mr. Thompson to prepare a letter, not the eviction notice, but something else, a formal notice to David and Claire that I own the house and that any changes required my consent. It was a warning shot, a way to assert my place without pulling the trigger. I mailed it to them, addressed to the house, and when David opened it a few days later, I was in the garden, pruning roses. He came outside, the letter in his hand, his face pale. "Mom, what is this?" He asked, his voice a mix of confusion and anger. I set the shears down and looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in months. He wasn't the boy I'd raised, but he was still my son, and that made this harder. "It's the truth, David," I said. "This is my house. I paid for it, and I decide what happens here." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came. I didn't raise my voice, didn't need to. The letter spoke for me. He turned and walked back inside, and I went back to my roses, my heart pounding, but my hands steady. Claire's reaction came later at dinner. She slammed her fork down and said, "This is absurd, Vivian. You can't just send us letters like we're tenants." I met her eyes calm but unyielding. "You're living in my home, Claire. That makes you guests, not owners." The room went silent, even Lily pausing with her spoon halfway to her mouth. David looked down at his plate, and Claire's face reddened, but she didn't push further. I ate my dinner, the food tasteless, but my resolve strong. I kept moving forward small steps that felt like leaps. I led the propagation workshop at the gardening club, and it was a success, women crowding around me afterward, asking for tips, inviting me to their gardens. I started painting in my art class, not just sketching, but using watercolors, the colors bleeding into each other like my emotions. I bought a new dress, a soft blue one that made me feel like the woman I'd been with Henry, and when I wore it to Margaret's book club, she clapped her hands and said, "Look at you, Viv. You're a masterpiece." But the house was still there, a weight I couldn't ignore. I knew I'd have to make a choice soon, stay and fight for it or let it go and start anew. I wasn't ready to decide, but I was ready to face whatever came. I wore Henry's watch, its tick, a constant companion, and I kept writing sketching, gardening, loving Lily. I was Vivian Harper, and I was no longer invisible. The next move was mine, and I was almost ready to make it. The letter I'd sent to David and Claire hung over the house like a storm cloud, silent but heavy. They didn't bring it up again, but I could feel the shift, Claire's clipped responses, David's avoidance, the way they'd huddle in their room at night whispering. I didn't eavesdrop, didn't need to. I knew they were rattled, and that knowledge gave me a strange calm. For so long, I'd been the one tiptoeing around their moods, but now the balance had tipped. I wasn't shouting or demanding. I was simply standing in my truth, and that was enough to unsettle them. I kept building my life outside the house brick by brick. The gardening club had become more than a hobby, it was a community. Ruth invited me to her house for tea, and I spent an afternoon in her greenhouse marveling at her orchids and sharing stories about our children. She'd had her own struggles, a daughter who'd moved across the country and rarely called, but she'd found peace in her plants and her friendships. "You don't stop being a mother." She said, her eyes soft, "but you learn to mother yourself too." Her words stayed with me, a reminder that I could love David and Lily without losing myself. My art class was another anchor. I'd moved from watercolors to acrylics, painting bold strokes of color that surprised even me. Carla, the teacher, encouraged me to enter a local art show, just a small one at the community center. At first, I laughed it off, me in an art show, but she insisted, and I found myself agreeing, choosing a painting of my roses, their petals vivid against a stormy sky. Preparing for the show gave me a purpose I hadn't felt in years. I'd spend evenings in the master bedroom, my easel set up by the window, losing myself in the canvas. It wasn't about being good, it was about being alive. I also kept exploring my options for the future. The financial advisor sent me more listings, cottages, condos, even a tiny farmhouse with a wraparound porch. I'd sit with my journal, sketching the houses, imagining myself in them. One listing, a bungalow by a lake, kept pulling me back. It had a small garden, a bay window room for Lily to visit. I wasn't ready to buy, but I asked the advisor to arrange a visit. Walking through it, I could see my life there. My paintings on the walls, my roses in the yard, a quiet that was mine. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, but it felt possible in a way it hadn't before. Back at the house, I kept my routines, but on my terms. I'd watch Lily when it suited me, not when Claire demanded it. I cooked for myself, and Lily letting David and Claire fend for themselves. I tended the garden, my roses thriving under my care, and I'd sit there with Lily telling her stories about her grandfather, about the love that had built this place. One day, she drew a picture of a rose and gave it to me, her crayon lines wobbly but full of heart. I framed it and hung it in my bedroom next to a photo of Henry. It felt like a promise to her, to myself, but the tension with David and Claire was growing, and I knew it couldn't last. One evening, I came home from art class to find them in the living room with a realtor papers spread out on the coffee table. Claire was talking about listing the house, her voice bright, like it was already decided. We could get a great price, she said, and move somewhere closer to the city. The realtor nodded, jotting notes, and David sat there, his eyes on the floor. I stood in the doorway, my bag still over my shoulder, and felt a cold fury settle in my chest. They were planning to sell my house without a word to me. I cleared my throat and they looked up, startled. "Claire David," I said, my voice steady. "This house isn't yours to sell. I own it and I haven't agreed to anything." The realtor glanced between us, confused, and Claire's face flushed. "Vivian, we're just exploring options," she said, her tone sharp. I didn't back down. "There are no options without my consent. You know that." I turned to the realtor who was packing up his papers, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding," I said. "This house isn't for sale." He nodded and left quickly, and Claire stormed out of the room, leaving David and me alone. He finally looked at me, his eyes tired. "Mom, why are you making this so hard?" he asked, his voice low. The question hit me like a slap, but I didn't flinch. "I'm not making it hard, David," I said. "I'm protecting what's mine. You and Claire forgot that, but I haven't." He opened his mouth and closed it, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or shame. But he didn't apologize, just walked away, and I stood there, my heart heavy, but my resolve unbroken. That night, I pulled out the eviction notice from my drawer and read it again. The words were stark, legal, final. I didn't want to use it, not yet, but I knew I might have to. I called Mr. Thompson the next day and asked him to prepare a second letter, this one outlining my terms for them. Staying in the house, they'd pay rent, cover utilities, and respect my role as the owner. If they couldn't agree, they'd have to leave. It was a bold move, but it felt right. I wasn't trying to hurt them. I was trying to save myself. I also started planning for the art show, pouring my energy into it. The painting of my roses was framed, and I wrote a small card to go with it, "Resilience" by Vivian Harper, for the strength that blooms in storms. The night of the show, I wore my blue dress, Henry's watch, ticking on my wrist, and walked into the community center with Margaret and Ruth by my side. The room was full of people, their voices a soft hum, and when I saw my painting on the wall, I felt a surge of pride. Strangers stopped to admire it, asking me about the roses, the storm, the story behind it. I told them about my garden, about finding beauty in hard times, and for the first time I felt like an artist, not just a grandmother or a widow. Margaret squeezed my hand and whispered, "You're shining, Viv," and I was. I sold the painting that night to a woman who said it reminded her of her own mother's strength. The money wasn't much, but it was mine, earned by my hands, my heart. I used it to buy a new easel, a promise to keep creating. But the house loomed, and I knew the confrontation was coming. I mailed the second letter to David and Claire, outlining my terms. When they received it, Claire called a family meeting, her voice dripping with sarcasm when she invited me. We sat in the living room, Lily asleep upstairs, and Claire held the letter like it was poison. "This is insane, Vivian," she said. "You can't treat us like tenants." I looked at her then, at David, who wouldn't meet my eyes. "I'm not treating you like tenants," I said. "I'm treating you like guests who've overstayed their welcome. This is my house, and these are my terms. Accept them, or we'll need to talk about other options." Claire laughed a harsh sound, but David stayed silent, his hands clenched. I didn't push, just stood and left the room, my heart racing but my steps steady. I knew they'd fight it, but I also knew I was ready. The trust was in place. The eviction notice ready, my life growing stronger every day. I was Vivian Harper, and I was done being invisible. The next move would be theirs, but I was prepared for whatever came, my roots deep, my branches reaching for the sky. The days after the family meeting were taut like the air before a storm breaks. Claire and David didn't respond to my letter, not directly, but their actions spoke louder than words. Claire's politeness vanished entirely. She'd leave dishes in the sink, ignore my presence, and make pointed comments to David about needing their own space. David, for his part, withdrew further his silence, a wall I couldn't breach. I kept my routines, gardening, painting, spending time with Lily, but I was always waiting, bracing for their next move. I knew they wouldn't accept my terms quietly, and I was right. One evening, I came home from the gardening club to find a letter of their own on the kitchen counter, addressed to me in Claire's sharp handwriting. My heart sank as I opened it, expecting a fight, but what I read was worse. It was a formal request typed and signed by both of them, asking me to transfer the deed to the house to David. We believe this is the best way to ensure stability for Lily and our family. It read as if I were the obstacle to their happiness. They'd even included a paragraph about how I could live comfortably in a senior apartment they'd help pay for, as if my life could be neatly packed away. I stood there, the paper trembling in my hands, and felt a wave of grief, not just for David's betrayal, but for the boy I'd raised, who was now so far gone I barely knew him. I didn't cry, though I wanted to. Instead, I took the letter to my bedroom, placed it in the drawer with the eviction notice, and sat on the edge of the bed, Henry's watch ticking softly on my wrist. I thought of him, how he'd always known when to stand firm, how he'd look at me with that quiet strength and say, "You've got this, Viv." I needed that strength now because this wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about my place in the world, my right to exist, as more than a footnote in their story. I knew what I had to do, but the weight of it settled into my bones. Evicting them would mean breaking something I'd spent my life building, but letting them win would mean breaking myself. The next morning, I called Mr. Thompson and told him about their letter. His voice was steady, reassuring. "They have no legal grounds, Vivian," he said. "The house is yours, and they can't force you to transfer anything. If you're ready, we can move forward with the eviction." I took a deep breath and said, "I'm ready." He promised to finalize the papers and have them delivered by the end of the week. I hung up, my heart pounding, but there was no turning back. I'd given them a chance more than they deserved, and they'd chosen to push me further. Now I'd push back, not with anger, but with the calm certainty of a woman who knew her worth. I spent the next few days preparing not just for the eviction, but for what would come after. I visited the bungalow by the lake again, this time with Margaret. We walked through the empty rooms, the sunlight streaming through the bay window, and I could see myself there, painting, gardening, living. Margaret squeezed my arm and said, "This is your next chapter, Viv. You're ready for it." I wasn't sure I was, but I put in an offer using the savings I'd carefully guarded. It felt like a leap, but also like coming home. I also reached out to the gardening club asking if anyone knew a good realtor not to sell the house, not yet, but to explore my options. Ruth connected me with a woman named Linda, who was kind, but no nonsense. We met at a cafe and I told her everything, not just the house, but the betrayal, the trust, the eviction. She listened, her eyes sharp, and said, "You're not just selling a house, Vivian. You're reclaiming your life. Whatever you decide, I'll make sure you get what you deserve." Her words were a lifeline, and I asked her to start researching the market to give me a sense of what the house could bring if I chose to let it go. Back at home, I kept my distance from David and Claire, focusing on Lily. I'd take her to the park, read her stories, teach her to draw flowers. I wanted her to remember me as her Nana, not as the woman her parents fought with. One afternoon, as we sat in the garden, she looked at me and said, "Nana, why is Mommy mad?" Her question broke my heart, but I smiled and said, "Sometimes grown-ups disagree, sweetheart, but I love you, and that's what matters." She nodded her small hand in mine, and I vowed to protect her no matter what happened next. The eviction papers arrived on a Friday, delivered by a courier who handed me the envelope with a neutral nod. I didn't open it, just placed it in my drawer, waiting for the right moment. That night, I cooked dinner for myself and Lily, leaving David and Claire to their takeout. Claire barely looked at me, but David's eyes lingered like he wanted to say something but couldn't. I didn't push. I was done chasing him. The next morning, I asked David and Claire to meet me in the living room. I'd planned it carefully, wanting it to be formal but not cruel. Lily was at a friend's house, and the three of us sat across from each other, the air thick with tension. I held the eviction notice in my hands, its weight grounding me. "I received your letter." I said, my voice steady, "and I've thought about it. But this house is mine. I paid for it, I built it, and I've let you live here out of love. But that love hasn't been returned." Claire's face tightened, but I kept going. "I've tried to find a way for us to coexist, but you've made it clear you don't want that. So I'm serving you this." I slid the eviction notice across the table. "You have 30 days to find a new place to live." Claire gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and David's face went pale. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking, "you can't do this." I met his eyes, my heart aching, but my resolve firm. "I can, David, and I am. This is my home, and I'm taking it back." Claire stood her chair, scraping the floor. "This is outrageous," she spat. "We'll fight this. You can't just kick us out." I didn't flinch. "You can try," I said, "but the law is on my side. I've spoken to my lawyer, and everything is in order." I stood smoothing my skirt and added, "I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing it to save myself." I walked out of the room, my legs trembling but my head high, and closed the door to my bedroom behind me. They didn't speak to me for days, but I felt their shock, their anger in every glance. I kept living gardening painting, planning my move to the bungalow. The gardening club threw a small party for me when my offer on the bungalow was accepted, and Ruth gave me a rosebush to plant there, a symbol of new beginnings. I framed another of Lily's drawings, this one of us together in the garden, and hung it next to my painting supplies. I was ready to let go of the house, not out of defeat, but out of strength. David finally approached me a week later, his eyes red, his voice low. "Mom, I'm sorry." He said the words heavy. "I didn't mean for it to come to this." I looked at him, my son, and felt a mix of love and loss. "I know," I said, "but you made choices, David, and so have I." He nodded, tears in his eyes, and I hugged him, not because everything was fixed, but because he was still mine, even if we'd never be the same. The 30 days passed, and they moved out to a rental nearby. I stood in the empty house, its walls echoing with memories, and felt a quiet peace. I'd taken it back not with vengeance, but with dignity. And I was ready for what came next. The house was quiet now, too quiet, the kind of stillness that settles into your bones. After David, Claire, and Lily moved out, the rooms felt like ghosts of themselves, empty but heavy with memories. I'd walk through the halls, my footsteps echoing, and see flashes of the past, Henry carving the Thanksgiving turkey, David running in with muddy shoes, Lily's laughter bouncing off the walls. But I didn't linger in those memories, not the way I used to. They were part of me, but they weren't all of me. I was Vivian Harper, and I was learning to live for myself, not just for the family I'd built. I didn't sell the house right away. Linda the realtor had given me a solid estimate, and the numbers were tempting enough to secure my future to travel to build something new. But I wasn't ready to let go, not out of attachment, but because I wanted to choose when and how. Instead, I moved into the bungalow by the lake, the one I'd dreamed about. It was smaller, simpler, with a garden that begged for my roses and a bay window that caught the morning light. The first night there, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, Henry's watch ticking on my wrist, and felt a peace I hadn't known in years. This was mine, chosen by me for me. The move wasn't easy. Packing up the house meant sifting through decades of life photo albums, Henry's tools, David's old baseball glove. I kept what mattered, my sketches, Lily's drawings, a box of letters Henry had written me when we were young. The rest I donated or stored, letting go of the weight I'd carried for too long. Margaret helped her laughter filling the bungalow as we unpacked, and Ruth brought the rose bush she'd promised, planting it with me in the garden. "This is your new start, Vivian," she said, her hands dusted with soil. I knotted my throat tight, and we watered it together, the earth dark and full of promise. I saw Lily often, which was my greatest relief. David and Claire had settled into their rental, and though things were strained, David made sure Lily could visit. I'd pick her up on weekends, and we'd spend hours in the bungalow's garden, planting seeds, painting, or just sitting by the lake, her small hand in mine. I told her stories about her grandfather, about the roses, about the woman I was becoming. "Nana, you're happy now," she said one day, her eyes serious, and I hugged her close, tears prickling. "I am, sweetheart," I said, "and I want you to be too." I didn't know if she'd remember these moments, but I hoped they'd root in her the way my roses had rooted in me. David and I were rebuilding slowly. He'd call sometimes, his voice hesitant, and we'd talk about small things: Lily's school, the weather, his job. He apologized again more than once, and I listened, but I didn't absolve him. "I forgive you, David," I said one day, "but forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. We move forward from here." He nodded, his eyes downcast, and I saw the man he could be if he chose. Claire was another story. She kept her distance, her pride too bruised to bend, and I let her. I'd spent too long trying to win her over, and I was done. My energy was for Lily, for myself, for the life I was crafting. The gardening club remained my anchor. I led more workshops teaching women how to nurture their plants, and in a way themselves. Ruth and the others became family. Their homes open to me, their stories woven into mine. The art show had sparked something too. I kept painting, filling the bungalow's walls with color roses, Lake's Lily's smile. Carla, my art teacher, invited me to join a collective, a group of local artists who exhibited together. I said yes, nervous, but proud, and my next painting, a portrait of Henry's hands, rough and gentle, sold at a gallery downtown. The money went into a savings account for Lily, a gift for her future. I also started volunteering at the community center, helping with their gardening program for kids. It was a way to give back, to share what I'd learned. The children reminded me of Lily, their curiosity, a light in my days. One boy, shy and quiet, brought me a drawing of a flower he'd planted, and I framed it, hanging it next to Lily's. These small acts, teaching painting, planting, were my legacy now, not just for my family, but for the world. The house, though, was still unresolved. I'd visit sometimes, checking on the roses, walking through the empty rooms. Linda urged me to decide sell, rent, or move back, but I wasn't ready. Then one afternoon, as I stood in the garden, an idea came. I called Linda and asked if she could find a family to rent the house, someone who'd love it the way I had. "I want it to be a home again," I said. She found a young couple with a baby new to the area looking for a fresh start. I met them, saw the hope in their eyes, and knew they were right. I signed the lease, keeping the house in my name, the trust ensuring my control. The rent would support me, and the house would live on, filled with new laughter, new memories. I didn't tell David or Claire about the rental, not at first. But when David visited the bungalow to drop off Lily, he asked about the house, his voice tentative. I told him about the new family, about my decision to keep it, but let it go in my own way. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I'm glad, Mom. It deserves to be loved." It was the closest we'd come to healing, and I took it for what it was. One evening, as the sun set over the lake, I sat in the garden with Lily. She was drawing her crayons scattered on the grass, and I was holding a locket my mother's passed down to me when I was young. It was simple silver with a rose etched on the front. I'd worn it on my wedding day, and Henry had kissed it before slipping it around my neck. I opened it, showing Lily the tiny photo inside me, and Henry smiling young, full of dreams. "This is for you," I said, placing it in her hands. "When you're older, it'll remind you who you are and who loves you." She looked at it, her eyes wide, and hugged me tight. I held her, the locket warm between us, and felt a wholeness I hadn't known I could find. I still wore Henry's watch, its tick a steady companion, but I didn't need it to feel him anymore. He was in the roses, in Lily's laugh, in the woman I'd become. I'd taken back my house, my life, my story, not with vengeance, but with grace. And as I sat there, the lake shimmering in the dusk, I knew I was at peace. My worth wasn't measured by who accepted me, but by how I chose to honor myself.